Washington, when I was doing my research, became a favorite, not because he's the first president, but what you realize is, he's a really fascinating, interesting, clever guy. And what Washington was able to do is would be very, very strategic. Now, we all know he grew up in Mount Vernon, but what we often don't realize is he was the child of a second marriage, and his father had a son from the first marriage. And when his father dies, when George is like 13 years old, his dad makes no accommodation for George in the estate plan, including paying for George to go to college. So George has to figure it out. But George is good with connections. And in the high net worth world, who you know sometimes matters more than what you know. And he was friends with his neighbors, the Fairfaxes. We know them today as the Fairfaxes of Virginia. And he was very good. Once the Fairfaxes took him under their wing, George had a knack for budgeting. And George Washington's budgets are all throughout, the Library of Congress. Mount Vernon has some, and they're beautiful. And George Washington budgeted constantly. And it's so funny because why this is so important with George Washington is he uses his budgeting to problem solve. So when you look at his correspondence throughout the Revolutionary War, yes, he's concerned about what's going on in the war. He's also managing a massive plantation because once he learned how to survey through the Fairfaxes, he started to buy up a ton of land. And then he did something very strategic. He married up. He married a wealthier woman. He was one of the wealthiest men in the United States, but he was constantly managing his businesses, writing his overseers. I've read letters of his where he's selling off small tracts of land and people are trying to pay him in these land certificates. And he's like, no, I want cash. George was very savvy in running his businesses. And when you had that type of plantation, you were like a CEO. And so I think what the takeaway from George Washington is, business-wise, is figure out how do you maximize data that you can make decisions. For him, it's these pristine budgeting exercises. And by the way, he was not paid to be the commander of the Revolutionary Army. He told them he would take no salary because he strategically knew it was better to be honorable. But he told Congress they had to pay his expenses. Congress had no idea it would take 8 years to finish the war. George Washington's expenses were $160,000 in that time period. They went through and they audited the books and they were perfect. The numbers tied up. But you see on key dates, George Washington's buying corn for people, on July 4th, 1776. So big days in American history and George is still budgeting. But again, data is important and how you absorb data and how you're willing to decide what is the priority. And I say this because other people of that time period, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, were often unwilling to do the hard work of selling a little piece of land to create liquidity to keep the business going. George Washington was incredibly savvy.